So this is a talk that I gave at Develop last October, I think. And I wanted to live stream it before I gave it, but I ended up being really sick the week before, so I couldn't finish the talk or present it in the previous week. But so I'm finally giving it now because it's been a long few months. I timed it quite well at the time, and it was very precisely on the dot of 45 minutes, but it's been a while now, and I did a practice run this morning, and I rambled and talked for far too long, so I'm going to try and rattle through it at a fair clip, rather than going into too much detail on each slide, and then I'll try to do questions at the end if anyone's interested in asking questions. Normally I do these sorts of things at work, and I just stop for questions as I go through, but I think in this case I'll completely throw my flow off because it's designed to be given as a single continuous presentation, so I'll just give it that way. Right. I'm not sure how you do a talk on Twitch. I don't think this is really a thing that people do, but I'll sort of, because all of the conventions assume that I'm sitting in a room of people, or that there's a Zoom call full of faces that I'm talking to. It doesn't really work on Twitch, but thank you for coming to my talk, I guess. This is avoiding the pitfalls of interactive narrative. I'm in the wrong window. So a little bit about me before I start, because that's what you do at the start of talks. Yeah, PowerPoint, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't read in the chat. Gotta maximize this so I can't read the chat. So hi, I'm Tim Fletcher. I'm a senior designer. I work on RuneScape at Jagex. Everyone at Jagex has a secret code name. Mine is ModJack, and you can find me on Twitter at JagexJack. This is a fantastic exploitable meme template picture of me. My responsibility at RuneScape at the moment is supervising the overall storyline. So I coordinate between different updates to tell the story. So we're now in 2022. I wrote this presentation in 2021, but we're currently in the middle of a storyline called the Elder God Wars, which has been gradually building in intensity. In the middle of the year, we ran a big lore event, Battle of the Monolith. And then since then, we've been releasing a succession of updates called the Elder God Wars, the most recent of which was the Zekar front towards the end of last year, one of 4 bosses that the players are confronting one by one. I also, in my spare time, like to develop other games as well, not just RuneScape. So I've recently been playing a lot of Arkham Horror, the living card game, and I made a full campaign for it called Betrayal at the Mountains of Madness, which you can find on the Steam Workshop. So go have a look at that if you're into Arkham Horror, the card game. But, and yes, one final thing is this talk does contain spoilers for Mass Effect, the Star Wars sequels, and RuneScape. So, if you don't want RuneScape spoilers, stop listening now. So, a summary of what I'm going to be talking about as we go through. I'm going to pose a question, the question that I'm hoping to answer during this talk. I'm also going to be talking more specifically about Mass Effect 3. I'm going to be using Mass Effect 3 as the example, the frame that I use for that question. I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the mystery box, which you're familiar with the work of J.J. Abrams, you may recognize. Then I'm going to go through some concrete maths, the maths that is involved in interactive narratives and the problems that poses. I'm going to talk about something that on RuneScape we call hazeeling, which is something that's really affected the way that we tell interactive narratives. Then I'm going to give a bit of a concrete example from RuneScape called the Sixth Age, and how the issues that I'm talking about in this talk have affected our game and company specifically. Then finally, I'm just going to give an answer to the question that I posed at the start, and hopefully by the time I've got to that point in the talk, the answer will be obvious. I'm going to give it, but it should be fairly obvious by that point because of all the issues I've talked to at first. So one quick clarification here is I'm going to be talking about choice. This is about interactive narrative. It's about choices. Choices absolutely pervade games. Games are all about choices. There's the choice of which weapon you have. There's the choice of whether you dodge to the left or the right. The choice of whether you go down the corridor to look for the treasure chest or not. The kind of choices I'm talking about here are specifically big, discrete narrative choices. Does the NPC live or die? Do you visit an entirely different level? Do you make the good or evil decision? Those aren't the only kind of choices, but those are the choices that people are usually thinking about when they say interactive narrative. We don't think of Doom as having an interactive narrative because I can choose to use a shotgun or not. So it's these big choices. So the question I'm going to pose, and the question that I'm hopefully going to answer for you, is why do games ignore my choices? This is something that I've heard players complain about. The games seem to be ignoring my choices. Of course, that's an extremely vague question. Games don't ignore your choices a lot of the time. I guess it should probably be, why do some games ignore some of my choices? So I'm going to ask a much more specific question. And for that, I'm going to look at Mass Effect 3. Now, the reason I've chosen to focus on Mass Effect 3, it's relatively recent. It got a remaster that was released last year. It was in the public eye for a while. It's a game that a lot of people have played, but most significantly, it's a game series that marketed itself very heavily on player choice, on the ability to make big, impactful choices. Those choices would be saved in your save game and imported into later games in the same series, where they would come back and they would matter. There would be consequences in the later games. So although there are quite a lot of indie games that have a lot of choice in interactive narrative and that sort of thing, Mass Effect is a big, high-profile AAA game series which not only had impactful choices, but which imported those impactful choices through the whole series. A trilogy of games, all based around choice. So the Mass Effect 3 version of that question is, why does Mass Effect 3 ignore my major choices from the series? Mass Effect 3 was controversial for various reasons. It was a very high quality game, but there were a lot of complaints about it at the time as well. This was one of the big ones. Why is it that I made choices and the game ignored them? So I'm going to go through some of those choices to just sort of illustrate the ones I'm talking about, in case that's clear. So first example is in Mass Effect 1, there are a species called the Rachni. They're like a genocidal alien locust race. You're confronted with the last of their species. You're asked, would you like to exterminate them? Because that way they can't slaughter every other living being in the galaxy again, or would you like to save the last of the race, give them another chance to exist? That choice ultimately makes no impact whether you save the Rachni or not. The Rachni still come back in Mass Effect 3. They still are an enemy that you have to fight regardless of what you chose. So essentially it's ignored. The second major choice you make in Mass Effect 3 is towards the end of the game. There's a huge space battle. The alien ruling council are aboard a giant spaceship. There's a risk of it being destroyed. You get to choose whether to sacrifice human lives to save them or let them die, thus ensuring that humans are more politically powerful because the alien rulers have all been killed. This ultimately makes no real difference throughout the rest of the game. It's mentioned a little bit in news articles and things, and the council, if the old council die, a new council is appointed. They have slightly different models, they have slightly different voice actors, but they fulfill essentially the same role in the story. So some NPCs died, but it doesn't really make any difference to the way the game plays out. And then the third thing in Mass Effect 1 is at the very end of the game, you appoint, or you choose to appoint, I'm not sure why it's your choice, but you seem to choose to appoint the human counselor, and you're given a choice between a sort of shrewd, manipulative politician with the implication that he's kind of a bad guy, but he's going to get a lot done, or this sort of upstanding, noble military guy, and you get to choose who of those gets appointed to the council. But by Mass Effect 3, it doesn't matter which one you chose. The shrewd guy on the left here, Councillor Udina, is always the human councillor, even if you chose for Anderson to be the councillor instead. They play specific fixed roles in the story of Mass Effect 3. Anderson is a soldier on Earth, Udina is a councillor in the Alien Council, and it doesn't really matter what you chose in Mass Effect 1. In fact, that one has an amusing technical story where I believe they didn't save it into the save game anyway, so that choice doesn't get brought forward in the series anyway, but they just ask you again at the start of Mass Effect 2 which one you chose, and then the choice that you make doesn't actually matter. It doesn't have any impact on the story. Finally, there's one in Mass Effect 2. The entire plot of Mass Effect 2 focuses around finding an alien base. The aliens are kidnapping humans. You want to go and find their base so you can stop them from doing that. When you finally get to the base, you're offered the choice of destroying it so that the evil alien technology doesn't fall into the hands of potentially dangerous actors, or keeping that technology because humanity would be stronger with that technology. And the implication is that the technology is kind of dangerous and perhaps shouldn't be used by humans. So it's framed as a moral choice. Unfortunately, as with the other examples, the plot of Mass Effect 3 hinges on the baddies having access to this technology from Mass Effect 2. It's kind of the same organization you're working with in Mass Effect 2 get this technology and then become baddies in Mass Effect 3 partly as a result of this technology. So once again, you make the decision to destroy the base. Not only is that plot ignored, but they even if you destroyed the base, they've recovered pieces of it and are just using it anyway. So it honestly just didn't make any difference. So, to return to the question, why does Mass Effect 3 ignore your major choices from the series? Why don't we ask the players? This is a good source of finding out anything, right? We want to know what's wrong with this game. Let's ask the players. Let's see what they think. Here they are. There's the players. They look ready and willing to give us a well-reasoned answer. And what did they say when we asked them what went wrong with Mass Effect 3? They think it's because the developers are lazy and incompetent. Are they right? I mean, my instinct as a game developer would be to say that probably the accusation of laziness is always wrong. Like, game developers are rarely lazy. They're much more known for overworking than for underworking. They're known for working long, unpaid overtime. It's not how we do it at Jagex, but it's a stereotype of the industry. It's very unlikely that they weren't putting in the work. But I mean, we can look at the facts of it. Actually, Mass Effect 3 has loads of consequences. It's not a game where there are no consequences for things. There's a huge amount. Hundreds of choices are getting imported into Mass Effect 3, and most of them are reflected somewhere in the game. Enormous amounts of dev time were poured into making sure that your choices do have consequences in Mass Effect 3. And in fact, beyond that, there's loads of optional content in Mass Effect 3. They put the time in, the effort. Every character in Mass Effect 2, every main party character in Mass Effect 2 can die, and each one of those characters from Mass Effect 2 has an optional quest, which you only experience if they survive Mass Effect 2. In fact, I believe if you play Mass Effect 3 without playing Mass Effect 2, it defaults to them all being dead. So this is something like 10 or more optional quests that only exist if you imported a save from Mass Effect 2 and if you saved that character in Mass Effect 2. So that's a real commitment to providing optional content. It's only those really big choices that were ignored. So, like, if it's not because of the developers really put the time and effort in, where is the responsibility for that? Why is it that Mass Effect 3 failed? We think of it as a failure of Mass Effect 3. But the responsibility for this Mass Effect 3 problem of ignoring choices actually lies with Mass Effect 1. What? Okay, so to explain this, I need to talk about project management. Right? Project management is absolutely crucial to this. But I'm a game designer. I don't really want to talk about project management, so I'm going to give a really quick overview of project management as I see it, just a sort of quick overview, what I need to know about project management to do my job well and hopefully to avoid the problems that Mass Effect 3 has. So, here's my brief overview of project management. Number one, let's do some planning. We'll plan for our project. We'll work out what we need to do. That's a good idea. Let's work that out on paper. We've planned for it. And number two, let's scope our project. Let's work out, do we have time to do it? That's a pretty good overview of project management from a game designer's point of view, right? Two crucial stages you should do. Then, having done that, we'll just jump in and make the thing, right? Brilliant. So, first we're going to have to talk about planning. But, as I said, I'm a game designer. I don't really want to talk about planning. Planning is boring. So instead, I'm going to talk about J.J. Abrams. Let's talk about the mystery box. So this is J.J. Abrams. This is a shot of a famous TED talk that he did called The Mystery Box. I'd encourage you to go and watch it. It's an important part of pop culture. But the key takeaway I'm going to have here is the way that people have interpreted his talk based on the work that he does is this statement. Mysteries are more powerful than answers. This appears to be the way that J.J. Abrams thinks about storytelling. Hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. So, we've got this question, why does Mass Effect 3 ignore my major choices from the series? The analogous question I'm going to make for the work of J.J. Abrams thinking about the mystery box is, why doesn't The Last Jedi provide satisfactory answers to the mysteries posed in The Force Awakens? And by answering this question, I hope I'll illuminate a little bit about the way Mass Effect 3 works. So, The Force Awakens was a J.J. Abrams film which was built around his mystery box principle. It's full of unanswered questions. It tantalizes and teases you with intriguing ideas. Who is Snoke? Who are the First Order? Where did all this come from? What's Kylo Ren's real background? But the one that I'm going to focus on here is who are Rey's parents? This is a question the film really wants you to care about. It gives you several flashbacks, sort of teasing at who they are. It's a key motivation for Rey's character. She doesn't know who her parents are. She doesn't know why they abandoned her. Their identity is implied to be as significant because of how powerful a user she is. That's implied to have something to do with her lineage. So then The Last Jedi comes along, and it has to answer this question. The second film in the same trilogy, it wants to provide an answer to this question. Famously, the answer is they're nothing but filthy junk traders. The answer is there isn't anything special about your parents. They don't matter. They're not an important part of the story. I think Kylo Ren, in fact, says something like that. So, I mean, great. We answered the question. Mystery posed, mystery answered. What did the players think about this? Did the players like that answer? Were they happy about that? Did they feel satisfactorily? No, they hated that answer to the question. I mean, it wasn't the only thing they hated about The Last Jedi, but it was an example of one of the things that the fans hated about The Last Jedi. They did not like that answer to the mystery. In fact, they hated it so much that when we came to The Rise of Skywalker, the third film in the trilogy, which was back again with J.J. Abrams, they in fact rejected that answer and retconned it, gave us a new answer. The answer is, well, okay, Emperor Palpatine is not Rey's parents, but he is her grandfather. We still don't actually know who her parents are. They're not, I don't think they're even named. But the important thing is that she is his descendant. And because she is his descendant, that explains her force powers, and it explains why she's so important to the story, and it reinforces the idea that your lineage and bloodline are the only thing that really matters. So great, mystery answered. New answer, we retconned it, better answer. Turn back to the players. Are we happy now? Is this good? Is this mystery answer good? No. Somehow this is worse. Somehow, despite having 2 attempts at answering this question, we have 2 bad answers, and the second answer is even worse than the first one. Now the storyline seems somehow even more ridiculous. So how is it possible that there are 2 bad answers to this question? We had 2 goes at it in like the largest, well, arguably like the largest intellectual property in the world, had 2 goes answering the same simple mystery and came up with 2 bad answers. The answer is there are no good answers. I'm going to demonstrate that by going through all of the possible answers and demonstrating that they're all bad. So what possible answers are there to who Rey's parents are? Well, the first one is that they're nobody. This is the answer that The Last Jedi goes with. Now, actually, from a sort of literary analysis point of view, this is actually a really clever answer. The Last Jedi is quite a sophisticated film. It has a lot going for it. It takes this question and it turns it into what is effectively an essay on the subject of lineage not mattering, of the fact that anybody can do anything. It's a good answer in terms of telling an interesting story and making an interesting point. As an answer to the mystery, extremely unsatisfying. It doesn't actually do anything with that mystery. It doesn't give us an answer that feels like an answer to the mystery. It just kind of ignores the mystery. It says, no, you were stupid to care about that mystery. So a great answer. Secondly, it could be a new character. Now, this isn't actually a bad answer in terms of telling a story. We could have an entire film based around this new character. It could be the story of Rey's parents. That would be awesome. We could tell a really cool story. We could have some really interesting, cool characters that we learn a lot about. We really enjoy that film, and now we know who Rey's parents are. Great, good story. But it's a bad answer to the mystery. Imagine it in the context of a murder mystery, that we've set up a murder and we want to know who did it. And then the answer, that Columbo comes in at the end, not Columbo, the Belgian guy, Poirot, comes in at the end and says, actually, it's a character you've never heard of before, and let me tell you about this character. And then he tells this little story about this new character that you've never heard of. And it's a cool story, and you're intrigued by this character. But that's not really a satisfactory answer to a mystery, because a mystery should set up clues, as The Force Awakens does, and then use those clues to answer. So a new character doesn't really answer those clues. Number 3, it could be any existing Force user. It could be Mace Windu. It could be Obi-Wan Kenobi. It could be Darth Plagueis, right? And in any of those cases, any existing Force user, you'd be like, so what? Like, okay, cool, it's Ahsoka. She's Ahsoka. I mean, I don't know how, because she's human, but she's Ahsoka's human descendant somehow. So what? Like, does that actually tell us anything? We've answered the mystery, but it hasn't added anything to the story. It hasn't really told us anything. It's reinforced the idea that Jedi are powerful because their parents are powerful. Great, but so what? Even worse, it could be an existing non-Force user. It could be Han Solo, which would make her romance with Kylo Ren a bit dodgy. It could be any character in the setting. It could be one of the characters from Rogue One. Again, so what? It doesn't tell us anything. The mystery isn't intriguing. It doesn't matter. So in any of those 4 answers, we don't really get a satisfying mystery. We don't get a satisfying payoff to the clues that we were given that makes us go, yeah, great. I get it now. I see why they posed that mystery. There are no good answers to this question, and they would have realized that if they'd planned out the mystery in the first place. Quite famously, like The Force Awakens posed all of these mysteries without planning what the answer was going to be, and then left it to the second film to figure out answers to those mysteries. So because they didn't do the planning, they didn't realize that. So here's my very crude Gantt chart for the development of The Force Awakens. Oh, sorry, for the sequel trilogy as a whole. So the red line represents the ship date for The Force Awakens. The box with mystery in it, this is them doing the work to set up the mystery, to ask the question, to have the little flashback scenes, to give the clues as to who Rey's parents could be, and then they ship it, and then much later on, I guess the same thing is true during the development of The Last Jedi and during the development of Rise of Skywalker, they try to provide an answer long after the ship date, long after they had any opportunity to change the mystery, because it's already been live for 2 years at this point when they're trying to work out the answer. They can't go back and change it now. What they should have done is they should have worked out the mystery, then they should have put the work in to answer the mystery, and then they should have shipped The Force Awakens. So even if they didn't actually answer the mystery in the film, they would at least have that answer ready to go for the next one. And so, I think the same logic here basically applies to choices and consequences. Here's the development of Mass Effect 3. Here's, at the got they're deciding on the Rachni. We've got the ship date there with the red line. They didn't really know what they were going to do, and then much later on they have to work out, how are we actually going to pay off this whole Rachni plot point. I don't really know. I guess we'll figure it out. What they should have done is, provided the choice and done the work to work out what the consequence was going to be before they go live, and then that way when they come to actually implement the consequence, they know what they're doing. So that brings me to my first concrete tip. If you don't plan it out, you don't know if it will work. Like when you're setting up a choice, you need to be confident that that choice actually pays off. So you need to plan the consequence of that choice. Like you don't need to ship it, but you do need to plan it. You need to be handing the design document to the next developer, which might be you, poor schmuck in 5 years who actually has to answer this. So give yourself a hand by giving yourself the design document with the intended consequence of the choice. That way you'll know with confidence that this choice that you've proposed does actually lead to a consequence that you can pay off. But you do need to remain flexible. Plans change, developers change, leadership changes, strategies change, games industry trends change. It may be that the consequence you intended did not work out. So make sure that you are able to change it. At least if you know there's one good answer, you know that the question can be answered in a satisfactory way. So next I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Rachni. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on this this particular choice. So I said you need to plan it out. Now I wasn't present for the development of Mass Effect 1. I wasn't on the dev team. It's inappropriate of me to say they didn't plan. Maybe there was a plan, but if there was a plan, they must have had to change it, because I can't believe that their plan was imply that the choice is really important, and then our plan is to ignore your choice and say that it doesn't really matter. So why did they have to change the plan? Well, but now we need to talk about the second half of project management, which is scoping. So we've got our plan, but now we need to check how long does it take to develop this. But I'm not a project manager. I don't really want to talk about scoping, so instead I want to talk about the insufferably cruel mathematics of branching choices, but that wouldn't fit on all of my slides, so let's just call it choice maths. So choice maths is working out how much our choices cost. So if we're going to do maths, if we're going to measure something, we need a unit. So here's my unit. This blue box represents like a unit of game development. In most games, that would be a level or something like that. In RuneScape or an MMO, that would be a quest. It's a discrete unit of like narrative development. So I can, it doesn't matter how big this is. In a small game, this is going to be very small. In a large game, this is going to be very large and expensive, but it's one unit of game development. So then we can construct a game by stringing these together. So here's 6 quests or 6 levels strung together linearly to make a game. You could even apply the same logic to a game series. Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 are 3 games that form a game series, and the same logic applies. So, what we've got here is a basic game, a basic linear game, and we can contrast that with what we would think of as just the default setup for a branching game. So here we've got the same 6 units of game development. The cost is essentially the same. It's a tiny bit different, but it's essentially 6 units of game development. But this time we've broken it up into a branching structure here. I've cheated a little bit. I've made 2 of these branches point to the same one, just so it adds up to 6 again. But you could do the same thing with 7 if you wanted. It wouldn't make any difference. So we can make some observations about this branching structure. Compared to the linear structure, the first thing we can see is it's half as long. Moving through that 3-step pyramid, it only takes me 3 levels to complete the game instead of 6 levels to complete the game. So I have a game that's half as long. Does that matter? I mean, for a lot of people, especially older gamers, especially people who work in the games industry, a game that's half as long might sound quite appealing. Actually, like, oh, thank God, I don't have to spend 150 hours playing this game. It's only 75. That sounds great. But actually, for a lot of players, game length is still something that they take into account. And is a metric that they judge games on, and games being too short is definitely something that receives criticism and will see negative reviews. So there is a real cost there. That's not something that can just be set aside. On the other hand, the game is more replayable. If I play through the linear game again, it may be twice as long, but it's exactly the same the second time round. The branching game, I can actually have quite a different experience. Only the first level is going to be the same. The second and third levels completely different. Wow, so it's a totally different experience on second time through. And that, there are players for whom that's really appealing. It's worth questioning what proportion of your player base will actually see that. The Steam stats for most games seem to show that barely anyone even completes the game the first time. It's unlikely that much of your player base is going to replay the game. But there is a kind of USP there, and it's a feature that you can market your game on is a feature worth having. It's just this one's extremely expensive. I mean, either your game is half as long or your game is twice as expensive, depending on how you think about it. In order to give you that back of the box feature that it has branching and it's highly replayable. So you're paying through the nose for this feature. There are probably cheaper ways to make your game sound exciting to a potential audience. It's worth noting, though, that depends on the cost of the content. So it depends on how expensive your units of game development are to produce. For example, in the visual novel space, the cost of producing two entirely separate levels is actually quite cheap. A level in a visual novel is typically just a single bitmap. We go to a different scene. We've gone to the warehouse instead of the factory. Well, that's just a bitmap, and even a bedroom indie coder can afford to pay for a single bitmap image. So actually, providing an entirely new level there is very cheap. So for a visual novel, the cost of producing content in that way is very low, and you can see that reflected in the way the visual novel genre works, where actually high amount of branching, different endings, that sort of thing is expected, and a simple linear novel where you don't have any branching like that is derided and considered to be an unacceptable level of quality for that genre, because the cost of providing that branching is very low. By comparison, it's very bad for expensive content. In a typical sort of AAA game where levels are phenomenally expensive, the graphical fidelity is incredibly high, you've got voice acting, you've got motion capture, you've got, just ridiculous expense in AAA computer games now. We're talking about, hugely expensive, $1 million levels that your player isn't seeing, and you're having to provide twice as many of them. That's a big deal if you're talking about a linear AAA FPS. This is not a good way of getting a USP, because you're paying, doubling your cost from $1,000 to $2,000 is a very different prospect from doubling your costs from $10 million to $20 million. Those are just completely different worlds. So I guess my point here is branching is expensive. I'm not saying don't do it, but it's an extremely expensive way of making a game. It's an extremely expensive way of adding choice to a game. So what can we do instead? Well, we can cheat, right? So here's a simple layout. We've got 6 levels, they're linear, but somewhere in there the player is making choices that, although they go to the same level, although the majority of the content is the same, some small part of the content changes as a result of their choices. This shouldn't be, I don't mean to propose this as something super innovative. This is how most games work, or most games that have choice in them work. But what I couldn't find is any way that this is labeled, so I'm going to call it, just for the sake of being able to label it something, an interactive structure. It's not branching, because nothing branches, the outcome is the same, but there are small changes within the structure. That's not what the word interactive means, but I'm using it arbitrarily to label this particular type of content. So here's a little zoom in to see what I mean by some choices. So in box 1 here we have an NPC that's alive. I make some choice during level 1 here, and then as a result during level 2 they might be dead or they may be alive. So I made a choice. That choice was reflected within the game world, but it wasn't a full branch where an entirely different scenario happened. It's the same scenario. Perhaps I now have a companion. If I save them, then I now have a companion NPC in level 2 who follows me around and kills things for me. Perhaps they're merely there to offer advice. Perhaps they're replaced with an entirely different NPC who says something slightly different. The linear structure I gave isn't the only way of doing it. The key point here is the player has to complete all the content. So a typical BioWare RPG has a starting level, then it has a bunch of levels in the middle where I can wander around. In fact, all the Mass Effect games are structured in this way. I wander around between the different levels, then having done all of the optional objectives, sorry, not all of the optional objectives, all of the mandatory objectives, I then move on to the final level. I had to complete all 6 pieces of content, but I had some control in the way that I navigated those pieces of content. So, I mean, given this interactive structure, we can see that it's the same length. So I paid for 6 pieces of content. You know, I had the cost of 6 pieces of content, and the player got 6 pieces of content. So there's no complaints there about, you know, this game is too short. The expense, I mean, there is a little expense providing all of this interactive content and making that work, but ultimately, you know, I did get the same game for largely the same cost. Sorry, the same length of game for largely the same cost. I still get that feeling of agency. The branching narrative paid through the nose for that feeling of agency. You know, it doubled the cost of the game to give me a feeling of control. Here, I still have a feeling of control. I feel like my choices matter, but it didn't, you know, it didn't cost anywhere near as much. So I'm getting those. My headset turned off because I haven't got any sound coming through them. Apparently, it doesn't count the microphone. So yeah, so I'm paying a lot less for the same length and the same or similar feeling of agency. So my second tip is, I think what goes wrong, and with the example of the Rachni, what goes wrong with a lot of game development is that the developers imagine that they will be able to pay for a branching narrative. I'm sure whoever was coming up with the Rachni, the plan that they had was, they imagined that this choice was going to be very impactful. They imagined that there would be different levels as a result, or perhaps different, you know, 2 different versions of a scenario, or 2 entirely different scenarios. And that's what would happen. But then they ended up using an interactive structure as a compromise. So whether the Rachni are supposed to be alive or dead in the storyline, they actually just always end up alive. And so that's an interactive narrative, and that's what it was. That compromise from branching to interactive that caused it to end up unsatisfying. Instead of aiming for branching and then not being able to pay for it, just start out with an interactive structure. Don't assume that you'll be able to build a branching narrative, because I mean, on an expensive project, you probably won't. It will probably cost too much. I have personal experience actually of that from back in my modding days of just intending to set out to do something complex and branching, and then just ultimately not being able to deliver on it and having to reduce my scope over time. So I mentioned there that the player will still have the same feeling of agency, but that feeling of agency hinges on your ability to convince them. So I'm referring to here as finesse, like your ability to actually make the choice feel like it matters. Can you, having offered them, you know, you're not doing a full branch, the storyline isn't branching, the game is roughly the same, but you're still trying to sell them on the idea that the choices they make are having an impact. So how can we do that? With branching, it's almost like you can't fail. Like if you go to two entirely different levels, it's just obviously true that, you know, if the Rachni are alive in one story and dead in the other story, they're just not there. It's obvious that my choice was respected. In the case of what they actually did deliver, where the Rachni are still alive even though I supposedly killed them, now it's a question of, well, can they sell me on that? Does the dialogue, does the storytelling actually convince me that my choice was respected, even though in a gross sense it was ignored? So the answer to this is, it depends on what you implied. So let's go back and talk about the Rachni in more detail. The story that it sells us on is the Rachni are genocidal. It's quite important to the sort of lore and backstory of the Mass Effect universe that races can be a threat to all civilized people. This point comes up quite frequently, that there are races which, left unchecked, will destroy everyone, and addressing that is they return to again and again as a moral point in Mass Effect. Is it okay to wipe out this species because they would wipe out everyone else first? And the way that the decision in Mass Effect 1 is framed is, it's a huge risk. Like, saving them would be a huge risk because they are a genocidal species. There is a real risk here of killing everyone in the galaxy. That's quite a large cost. On the other hand, as it presents it, I don't necessarily agree with their presentation, but this is how Mass Effect 1 tries to sell you this choice. Exterminating the race would be morally unacceptable. It would be a gross contravention of your ethical standards to wipe out this species, because that's just immoral. That's just basically immoral. So are you prepared to take this risk in order to follow your moral compass? In short, the fate of the galaxy is in your hands. You know, you're making a hugely impactful choice here. You know, on the one hand, morality; on the other hand, total death and destruction. But then what happens in Mass Effect 3 is, whether they lived or died, they just get cloned anyway. Like the baddies in Mass Effect 3 just find a dead one and clone it. And so if you save them, there's an army of Rachni. And if you wipe them all out, there's an army of Rachni. So actually, you thought the fate of the universe was the galaxy was in your hands, but it wasn't. It just didn't really matter. Effectively, they've set up a plot point they can't deliver on. It seems a lot more impactful than it was. So this comes to my third tip. write choices that don't require branching. The choice that they wrote was one in which there were two very different galaxies, a galaxy with the Rachni in it and a galaxy without the Rachni in it. For that choice to matter, the Rachni have to be super big deal. Either, you know, they define the entire game because their implacable assault is, you know, is the story, or at least it's going to have an enormous impact on the way the story plays out. You know, an implacable genocidal alien race is a big deal. Like, that's huge. That's, you know, they're an entire army in 140,000. They are the entire plot in Halo. It should be a big deal. But in practice, they were never going to be able to deliver on that. The promise that they made couldn't be made off. So don't promise huge setting changes if you can't deliver them. Now, I mean, that's easy to say. Like, what should they have done instead? Well, I'm going to give an example from Mass Effect 1 of something they did manage to pay off. A similar level of quest to the Rachni in Mass Effect 1 is you visit a colony, Pharos. They've been dominated by some giant alien monster. You have to kill that giant alien monster as part of the quest. You don't have the choice to save it or let it live. But you do have a choice as to what to do with the colonists. They've all been mind controlled by it. You can either kill them you can fight them in a non-lethal way, which saves them all, or you can just kill them and shoot them all in the head. And if you kill everybody, then I think the colony is abandoned, or things don't go well for you. And this choice is reflected in the later games. If you saved the colonists, then some of them come back, they email you, they come and meet you, they say thanks for saving us. I can't remember if they give you a reward or not, but it sort of doesn't matter. Your impact on the world was reflected in a very small way, in a level that's appropriate to the choice that you were making. So it was a choice that you made, and it was a choice that the game could deliver on. So, I mean, thinking about that kind of minor choice, what would be a good way to give the player something minor, not galactically affecting, but something that you can do? Well, how about killing off characters? That sounds like a good one. That's the example in Pharos. Either the colony lived or died. Now, there's an example in Mass Effect here that I don't have time to go into in detail that they actually execute extremely well, which is Rex. If I have time at the end, I can talk about that in more detail. But my summary of that is that Mass Effect actually does an extremely good job of having Rex's status as a character that can be killed, maybe alive or dead, actually does kind of matter to the outcome of the series. But it's quite nuance to get into detail of that. So instead, I'm going to talk about a bad example, which is one from RuneScape, which is this fellow here called Haziel. So on RuneScape, we have a term, Hazieling, named after this character. Now, Haziel is a sort of immortal necromancer lich type character, you know the kind. And he first appears in a quest in RuneScape called Haziel Cult, where he's dead effectively, and his cult are trying to resurrect him, to bring him back so that he can, you know, bring ruin upon the lands of man and that kind of thing. So at the end of the quest, quite provocatively, quite excitingly, you're given the choice to help the cult to resurrect him, in which case he comes back and is now a threat, or you're given the choice to foil their plans and effectively kill him. He's no longer a threat because his cult are dead, and he can't exist. We think he's not technically dead, I suppose, or not any more dead, but he's effectively dead. We've prevented him from existing within the setting. So Hazieling is what we call it, named after Haziel, when a character may or may not be dead. The situation that the canon is in a broad sense, is Schrodinger. Like it's Schrodinger's NPC. They may be alive, they may be dead. It depends on the choice the player made. So there's a problem with this, because when you're trying to work with a character who has been Hazieled, there need to be alternatives. If you want to use them in a storyline, but they're dead, for the players for which that NPC is dead, you need an alternative. It might be a different NPC. It could be no one. I gave the example in Mass Effect earlier. If you kill the council, other councillors appear. If you kill Rex, Rex's brother Reeve appears and fills in for Reeve. There's quite a lot of examples in Mass Effect where an essential character is dead, so they have to provide an alternative. That just doubles the cost. So if you any content involved in using that character is doubled. You need a new voice actor. You need a new model. Probably, it depends on how complicated the models are. You need to write all new dialogue for them. If there are any gameplay implications, I mean, you could have an exact duplicate, but you would probably want them. Say this is a companion NPC that follows you around and fights for you. If they're just an exact clone of the character that's dead, then that's really unsatisfying. So you probably want them to have different mechanics, or you're doubling the cost. So in any situation in which you have the choice to focus on this character, you probably just use someone who's alive. So poor Haziel, who may or may not have come back as a result of Haziel Cult, That ought to be important. If Haziel is back, he's a deadly threat. Like, he's a serious threat that needs addressing. But we've never addressed that threat because that threat only exists for those players that chose that outcome of that quest. And it was a wacky choice anyway. Like, I don't have the statistics to hand, but there's no particular reason for the player to do that. So it's a kind of a minority opinion to even have him alive in the first place. So why would we include a quest about the character Haziel, the Immortal Necromancer Lich, when we have, half a dozen other Immortal Necromancer Liches we can use instead in that role? So we have occasionally had him on screen. He's appeared in bit parts here and there. Just if he's alive, then he appears on screen. And says, "Hi, it's me, Haziel. I'm still here, by the way." But he's never really had a major role in the storyline since, because there've always been other alternatives we could use instead at just lower costs. And it just makes more sense to use those other characters. So this leads us to, so we do use the term Haziel, Hazieling in Jagex. We don't talk about the law of Haziel, but that's what I'm going to pretentiously title it. The law of Haziel is a character who might be dead is effectively dead. You will probably not use them. There are counterexamples like I mentioned that Rex is good, but unless you're prepared to put the cost in, unless you're prepared to put the work and the time in, you're always better off just effectively assuming that they're dead. The problem we have on RuneScape is there was a period in our development history where we were just allowing the player to choose to kill major characters left, right, and center, and a lot of characters ended up in this Haziel Schrodinger state where they may or may not be dead. That was a problem because we actually wanted to tell stories for some of these characters. We wanted to be able to include them in content and tell quests about them. We'd love to follow up on Haziel. He's a cool character. We have a whole game term named after him. He's got cool horns. We'd like to use him in content, but to do that, we need him back. So, the correct way of getting a character back in this way is to provide a piece of content which is exclusive to the players that chose to have the character be dead. And then we show them in that content coming back to life in an organic way that's well told in the story. But this has the exact same problem as that we're trying to avoid in the first place, which is that we're providing content that only a minority of players can experience. And that isn't something, that's the whole reason we're not including the character in the first place, is that we don't want to do that. It's too expensive to correct that mistake well. So, unhazealing, this is the technical term for when we want to reverse this problem. All we can really do in the end is retcon their death. We just have them say, essentially, I don't think anyone's ever said this literally, but essentially say rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. They just suddenly pop back up in the world. The player might have the option to say, "I thought you were dead," and they say, "No, you were mistaken. When you thought I was dead, I was actually fine," or "I came back to life off camera. The choice that you felt like you were making actually didn't matter. I corrected it off camera." This is what happens in the example of, this is essentially what happens to the Rachni. The Rachni were exterminated, but their death was retconned off camera, and now they've been cloned and they're back anyway. Now you can use the character again. Brilliant. So perfect solution, no problem. No, this sucks. We don't want to do it. We don't want to have to retcon character deaths like this. The players don't like it. The players call us on it. They say, "Look, this isn't great, is it? This isn't very good storytelling." And honestly, they're right. That's fair enough. It's not a very good way of telling a story, but it's effectively digging ourselves out of a hole that we created. So this leads me directly onto my fourth tip. Just don't Haziel your characters in the first place. It's not actually a very good way of creating a cheap sense of you might be looking for minor ways to add agency and interactivity to your storyline. This is a surprisingly expensive one. It has unforeseen consequences. The character that you do this to, you may not be able to afford to use in the future. You may have actually just killed them off, and you have failed to create a sense of agency for the player because the players that chose to have the thing still exist also don't get to interact with them. Unless you've scoped the cost, and that's fine. If this is a key part of what you're trying to accomplish, if you've included this choice and you've done it, you've planned it out, you've scoped it, you know what's going to happen, great. That's fine, but don't do it on the assumption that it'll work out fine without the planning. So finally, I'm going to talk through a bit of personal example of this from RuneScape. I've been talking about, I talked about Haziel, but I've largely been talking about examples from Mass Effect. But actually, this whole thing is an experience we've gone through on RuneScape as well. Very similar sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about a storyline which I guess I'm actually talking about Sliske's game, but I'm talking about the Six Age storyline largely. The Six Age is a RuneScape storyline which is quite convoluted. It begins with this character Sliske. He's another immortal lich type guy. Kills our most famous god Guthix, thus kicking off a series of events that lead to all sorts of nonsense happening. So I've laid out the storyline here, and I'm going to talk through a few elements of the storyline. The Six Age was a series of quests, hence this same layout as I described earlier. It was linear, and I've labelled it pseudo-interactive. And the reason I'm saying that is it has this interactive structure where it's linear. You have to complete them in order. And within each of those quests, you make choices, fairly impactful choices in a lot of cases. But the impacts of those choices, the consequence of those choices, are not reflected in the next piece of content because they, for the most part, don't have any impact in the next piece of content. I gave some examples earlier of, the NPC is alive or dead. In this case, it's sort of like the NPC is alive or dead, but that NPC doesn't reoccur within the storyline for a while anyway. So it's not that the choices are immediately reflected, but that a number of impactful choices build up over time with the expectation they will all ultimately pay off. And maybe you can see where this is going. So I'm going to talk through some of the examples of content. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to particularly focus on the 3 coloured in boxes there. So the first purple box is a quest called Fate of the Gods. So in Fate of the Gods, we have a dark god character on RuneScape called Zaros. He is dead. His death was an important historical event that kicked off huge impactful things that determined the sort of history of the world and everything that happened afterwards. But, like all true dark gods, he's not actually dead. He can come back, he can be resurrected. So in a quest, the player goes and resurrects him. Now, the player is compelled to resurrect him. They don't have a choice in whether to do that or not, but they do have a choice over his fate. Specifically, they're offered the opportunity to sabotage his return. They can either help him to reform his body at full power, or they can use the wrong materials and sabotage it so that he's weaker. The implication, it's not really directly stated, but the implication of this choice is that you either believe in him, you think that the Dark God is actually the secret savior, you want to see him pursue his goals, and you want to help him pursue his goals, and by restoring him to full power, he's sort of sure to do that, or you don't trust him, you think he actually is evil, or at the very least, not a wise choice. You want to sabotage him so he doesn't achieve his goals. The implication that we're given is that our choice is really going to matter. So, we move on through the storyline. A few other things happen. We make a few other decisions, and we arrive at the teal box. The teal box is the light within. This focuses on another RuneScape god, kind of similar to Zaros, and it's revealed that this is in fact his sister. So Seren, she didn't die, but she was shattered into lots of different pieces. It's effectively a similar sort of fate. So during this quest, we reassemble her, put her back together, bring her back into the storyline as an entity that can walk around. Now, in this one, we're not given the opportunity to really sabotage her, but we are given the opportunity to integrate the darker elements of her personality. She's shattered, all of her bits are everywhere. You can choose to exclude the dark parts of her personality from her. Again, it's not quite as impactful as sabotaging her with the implication that you're going to be preventing her from reaching her goals, but there's a strong implication it's going to have quite a strong effect on her personality, and because it affects her personality, it's going to affect what she chooses to do, what her goals even are. So again, we're given this implication that this is really going to matter. Move on through the storyline. We make a few more choices, and then we arrive at the end of the storyline, which is the quest Sliske's Endgame. Now, Sliske's Endgame pays off a lot of choices. I've only highlighted 2 here. There were actually loads more in loads of other quests. Big, impactful choices the player made. I'm focusing on Zaros and Seren here, mostly as an excuse to include this cool piece of fan art. But the outcome of Sliske's Endgame is it's a competition where all of the gods are competing to win a prize. And ultimately, although any of the gods can technically win the competition, Zaros wants the prize. He's the dark god. This is Zaros wearing his full armor here, in case you don't recognize him. He wants the prize, and if you've restored him to full power, if you made that decision back in Fate of the Gods, then he always wins. Whoever it is that technically wins the competition, Zaros has outmaneuvered them, he's manipulated them, and ultimately he comes away with the prize regardless of the outcome of the competition. If he's not at full power, then Seren will win if you included the dark elements of her personality. If you included those dark elements, she's just as manipulative as he is, and if he's not at full power, she successfully outmanipulates him, and she wins the prize. If she's not got the dark elements, he wins even if he's weak. So there are two possible outcomes effectively. Three of the choices result in Zaros winning. One of the choices results in Seren winning, and then, regardless of who ultimately gets the prize, one of these two, the prize just gets destroyed at the end of the quest, and none of it mattered in the end. So we end up with a single linear outcome, regardless of the choices I made. So we turn to the players to see how they responded to this. Were they fond of this single linear outcome to all the choices they made? No, they expressed to us respectfully with constructive feedback that wasn't really what they wanted. They didn't really feel like it paid off the choices that they made. The implication was that this would really matter, that Zaros would or wouldn't accomplish his goals, that Seren would or wouldn't be a completely different person, and ultimately we were unable to pay that off. So what did we do about it? Like, how did we respond to this? Well, what we did was we unhealed everyone, and we merged the storyline. We effectively, there were many choices that have been made. Not all of this has happened, but we've told the players openly, you know, like the choices that you made, we will gradually sort of restore to a single timeline, a single storyline, so that we don't have this situation where the storyline can't proceed because the outcome is unclear. So the impact of all of those choices manifested itself in Slisko's endgame, and now we move on with a single storyline. So this is the example of this from last year. The big event of last year, sorry, not the big event, but like the storyline event that the events of the year hinged on, the Battle of the Monolith, involved Zaros doing something antagonistic, unarguably, unambiguously bad, and Seren opposing him and trying to stop him from doing that bad thing. And within the context of the choice, the idea that you can support Zaros, the idea that you may or may not support Zaros, you may or may not support Seren, that storyline doesn't make any sense. The idea that there's an antagonist that you're working against and not a protagonist, but a good force that you're working on the same side of, wouldn't have been possible. But now that we've removed that element of choice, we can now tell a story where there are sides, and you side on them one way or the other. What were the players like? Nah. I mean, it wasn't what they wanted. They wanted us to carry on with the heavy element of choice, but largely I would say they've been okay with it. They've accepted the cost that we've removed the element of choice and we've restored a single linear storyline. The players who were most disappointed were the ones who wanted to side with Zaros, who were disappointed that they were fighting against him in that battle. What we did was effectively rip the band-aid off and kind of force them to fight against Zaros to prove that was how the storyline worked now. But the basic fact of it is our storyline is linear, just like all the other MMOs are. Each of these gives a slightly different story, but they all ultimately work out the same way our storyline did. World of Warcraft's main element of sort of branching or storyline structure is in its faction split, while alternates on its different expansions between whether or not it thinks the faction split matters. But a typical WoW expansion begins with two different storylines, one for the Horde and one for the Alliance, where they work through, typically they fight against each other, and then sometime around the first content patch, the two factions will unite against a common enemy. They'll typically team up with some third-party neutral faction, and then they'll fight against baddies, the same baddie for the rest of the expansion. They don't do two separate storylines all the way through. Star Wars The Old Republic, even more extremely, starts with 8 different storylines. The game launch shipped with 8 storylines. The character class you choose just determines a completely different story through the game. But as they've released expansion content, that expansion content has been a single linear storyline that all characters experience, not something that reflects the character choices, or in some cases even the faction choice, like the light side dark side choice doesn't really matter very much in the ongoing storyline of Star Wars The Old Republic. And then Guild Wars 2 has a slightly more nuanced version of the Old Republic version. You start out with 5, you choose your character race, and the races start in different places, have very different storylines. In about the mid game of the launch content, you choose a faction. There are 3 factions. You do a little bit of content for those factions, but then those 3 factions merge, and then towards the end game of launch content, you're just doing a single storyline, and then that single storyline has carried on through their expansions. Which leads me to my 5th tip. MMOs are not a good format to explore choices and consequences. I have nothing against the design ethos behind like heavy choices, heavy consequences as a way of building games. Fantastic, great. But for an MMO, for a live game service, it just doesn't really work. I think this is largely because of the way that we deliver content. I think all of the MMOs have sort of independently come because of the same problem. We're expected to deliver content on a regular schedule. Our players judge us based on the content that we deliver to them. Content they can't play is content that doesn't exist from their point of view. If they expect one update a month or one update every 6 months or whatever the game happens to be shipping, and we ship an update in that period that they can't play, they are understandably aggrieved because it effectively doesn't exist from their point of view. So if we have a narrative which has a branching format where a piece of content may or may not exist for you, So in month 1 we do a quest where there are 2 choices, and then those 2 choices lead to 2 different quests, one in month 2 and one in month 3. What we have is half our players angry in month 2 because there was no quest, and half our players angry in month 3 because there was no quest. So that's it really. MMOs, not a good format for that. So, I mean, let's return to the question that we started out with. Why do games ignore my choices? And hopefully, it's clear that the question is just because the implied consequences are out of scope. The choices will probably always be paid off if it's something that's relatively simple to pay off, because the scope that they implied, the answer that they implied, is within the ability of the game to deliver. But if they promised an incredible branching narrative that the fate of the galaxy rests on, then they were never going to deliver on that, because it was never within the scope of them to deliver. And that's my talk. Thank you. So there's my reminder of my 5 key takeaways. Number 1, plan out your consequences before rather than after shipping the choice. Number 2, you probably can't afford branching. It's probably the wrong choice for your game. Use an interactive structure instead. Number 3, write for the structure you can afford. Build in choices that you can afford to pay off. Number 4 is Hazeeling kills off characters. It's not just a cheap way of creating outcomes for the player. And then number 5, MMOs are not suited to doing this kind of narrative choice exploration. Does anyone have any questions? I should have a look back through the Twitch chat. What we got? Catgirl said Last Jedi was my favorite Star Wars movie. If you mean of the trilogy, I totally agree. I think The Last Jedi was definitely my favorite of the sequel trilogy. But that, it's a good example because the outcome, the answers to the mysteries were so resoundingly rejected by the fan base. But then brilliantly, the nuances in the next film were so bad as well. Like, it's such a good example of that. Some discussions about whether or not Zaros's heel turn was actually. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the execution was largely my responsibility in terms of like dictating how the story should work, and I think I probably should have taken into account the negativity of the players a little bit better and anticipated that and sort of written it in a way that was a little bit more sympathetic. The plan was to rip the Band-Aid off, and we executed on that plan, but I think it could have been executed a little bit more sensitively, and it could have been a bit like the player could have had an opportunity to sort of object and have a compassionate explanation to them from an NPC that didn't make them feel like the storyline was targeting them and attacking them specifically for wanting to side with Zaros. I don't think that was the ideal implementation. Captain Lime asked, is there a good way to write the ship if you were in a Hazeeled storytelling state? I mean, my argument would be probably not. I mean, the ideal way is that you put the time in and you correct it. So if you can afford to put the time in, if you can do your 2 alternative quests that really elegantly and effectively sort of demonstrate how the storyline merges, great. I think in practice, a storyline merge will always feel cheap. I think that's my take based on playing a lot of games that try to do this. The storyline, it's easy to branch. It's very, very easy to branch a storyline. It's actually very, very easy to merge a storyline, but I think the player will always see that that's what's going on. They'll always spot. Or if they don't spot it. So the example for me, the reason I use the Rachni as an example in this a lot is that when I first played Mass Effect 3, I was playing it on a save file that had saved the Rachni, and I was extremely impressed that Mass Effect 3 had gone so far in respecting the consequences of my choice that there was an entire enemy type that was quite impactful in combat. I can't remember what they're called now, Ravagers. The Ravagers are undead Rachni, effectively, in Mass Effect 3, and they're like these rocket launcher monsters. And I was really impressed because it takes a lot of work to have an entirely different enemy type and then rebalance every combat encounter, or almost every combat encounter in the entire game, based on a decision I made back in Mass Effect 1. That really impressed me. So in a sense, they did successfully trick me there. But then when I replayed it again on a save file that didn't have the Rachni alive, and they were still there, and then there was this really flimsy excuse, oh yeah, we cloned them. Oh, okay, so actually they just ignored my choice. So you can fool a player with that kind of thing, but when it was clear that the storylines had merged, I felt like my choices didn't in fact matter. So you can dig yourself out of that, and you can even put the time in to do it well, better than Mass Effect 3 did with the Ragnar. You can put more time and have a better answer to that. But the player will probably still meta spot, oh, actually my input didn't really matter. It will work for some players. I'm still not convinced it's worth it personally, but it's kind of a judgment call really. Kuto asked, do you see some parallels between RS quests and visual novels in terms of at least dialogue branches? As in, would a branching quest be feasible just in bringing the player to a different location for the same or similar events? If you mean within the context of a quest, could there be choices within a quest? Then yes, I think so. The main issue that I'm focusing on here, I guess I should perhaps clarify slightly more, is to do with the implications for future content. That's why I'm using Mass Effect as an example and RuneScape as an example, because often we're developing content in a game series or in a live game. We're developing content without the future content is only fairly vaguely planned. So we're vaguely planning that future content, but we don't. Sorry, my headset turned off again. We don't know what that future content is going to be, so we're kind of roughly setting up the future us to deal with it within the scope of a piece of content that you are shipping. So I am making a quest, I am shipping. The quest will be finished at the point when I ship it. You could do anything you like. Like if you've got a choice within the quest that pays off within the quest, and the consequences of that choice are explored within that one quest, that's absolutely fine because you are effectively doing the work. You could also, if you're doing the work up front, you could make one quest that has a choice that pays off in another quest that's already implemented. Sorry, am I back? I think my headset's working again. I should get XSplit so I can see. Yes, I am. Sorry. Yes. So as long as most of my sort of danger warnings are around not planning it out for the future. So as long as you've really thought through the consequences of what you're doing and have planned for it and have scoped for it, it's absolutely fine. So you can, in theory, do those things. I don't believe personally that an MMO will work particularly well in that regard. But if there was a minor choice that was made within one quest that paid off and you had planned how it was going to pay off in another quest, that would be fine as long as the plan is there, as long as the consequences of it have been delivered on. Captain Lime asked, are you still exploring novel ways to incorporate interactivity? I mean, personally, I would say as a designer, it's not really a strength of mine. So I am not, but a lot of the other designers and developers are much more keen on that stuff than me, and I expect it will still keep cropping up here and there. I'm arguably too focused, but my key focus is on sort of telling a good story in the first place. And I don't think that interactive stories are necessary within a game. Some people think that if the story isn't interactive, it sort of doesn't count. And there's nothing wrong with making games like that. And so I talked about my Arkham Horror campaign at the start, and that's like explores different ways of having consequence to outcomes and choices with arguable results. But for example, there are other people working in that space who are sort of having their full storyline branch or things like that. So I would say, Jagex as a whole, yes, I think probably are going to continue to explore ways to incorporate interactivity. For me personally, it's not a priority compared with nailing down the basics of telling a compelling story. Syracuse said, Witcher 2 is a good example of delivering on key player choice, but it basically just splits into two separate games from a different perspective. Yeah, that's the exact example of branching. That would be like linear storyline up until the end where it branches. So from the point where it branches, they're effectively just paying double the cost, and that's fine if you've budgeted for that, and that's an important thing to deliver on. And that's the way you want to sell your game. Then great, that works. And Nathan119 said, yes, Witcher 3 fails to deliver on that. So my understanding of it, so I've played about half of The Witcher 1 and a bit of The Witcher 3. My understanding is that although you make a big choice in The Witcher 2, it's not paid off in The Witcher 3, which is why I used Mass Effect as the example, because Mass Effect claims at least to import your choices. I believe you can't. Can you even import your save from The Witcher 2? So in a sense, there is a choice within that game, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But then The Witcher 3, it's not a choice-based series. It's just a series of choice-based games, if that makes sense. Yeah, I did start playing The Witcher 3 in preparation for this talk, but didn't. I didn't manage to finish it. I managed to stream about 4 hours of it, and then ended up having to give the talk. And Nathan says you can. The choices are related to minor payoffs that don't feel fulfilling. Yeah, that's the same thing, right? I mean, so I haven't played it, but I assume it's some combination of the choice sounded like it was going to be quite promising, but then ultimately it didn't really go anywhere. And I'm assuming, and my assumption would be that's just related to budget. Paying off choices is expensive. It's really expensive, and it makes delivering a game harder. One of my experiences I mentioned before, I used to work in Neverwinter Nights a lot, and a lot of my thinking on choice comes from trying to deliver on that. I started out with your class. Neverwinter Nights is a D&D game, a D&D computer game, and I was making a custom adventure for it. And I started out with each character class having a completely different story, or sorry, not a completely different story, but a different reason why they were engaging in the main story, and they would sort of gradually merge into the main story, you know, as your personal objective gradually merged into the main objective. And I ended up just having to abandon that because it was so much extra work. It was just getting the main story done was really, really hard. Like, it was a lot of work, and then having to then add in like 11 side stories with payoffs later and different endings, and you know, it was just a phenomenal amount of work. And I ended up having to cut, so my demo of that has a huge amount of personal content which doesn't exist in the main one. In the main one, you all just start in a pub dressed in rags, and everyone has the same story, and your character class is ignored as far as the game is concerned. Which is a real shame, but I couldn't pay it off. So it doesn't surprise me to see other game companies struggling with the same kind of issue. Hexgrid said Temple of Elemental Evil did something like that. Yeah, although that was very simple because after in Temple of Elemental Evil, there are like 9 different intros, one per alignment, but then they don't matter after that. I don't think later in the game it makes any difference. It's just because Temple of Elemental Evil isn't really a plot-based game anyway. It's just a dungeon, really. So it was like, here is your reason for going to this dungeon in the first place, but then you just go do the dungeon. The stuff I had was something like, if you're a wizard, you are trying to join the wizard school, so that's why you're going to the city in the first place. If you're a paladin, you're a member of a knightly order, and you're going to the city to sign up with your knightly order. And all of them kind of demanded follow-on content to make that work, because you know you were going to go do a thing, and I started writing huge chunks of it, and then just couldn't do it. The other concrete example I have from those times, because I don't have many examples of this personally on RuneScape because I've gone out of my way to avoid making this kind of content due to my personal experience of it beforehand. But the other concrete example for Neverwinter Nights I have is in Neverwinter Nights you could have up to 2 companion NPCs, and I had a choice of 4. Like 4 people who could join your party. One of them could be in one of 2 states. Like when they join your party for the first time, you make a choice, and it effectively turns them into 2 different personalities. So they have 2 different sets of dialogue for that. You could also have no one. You could have no one. You could have 1 companion, or you could have 2 companions of a choice of effectively 5. That meant that every major storyline event where I wanted my party NPCs to join in and have a conversation and organically respond to each other required 17 different versions of that conversation based on the layout of your party, like the way your party members would interact. And I did go through and I did write all 17 versions of each conversation for each major plot event, and it was so grueling. I was like, I'm never doing this again. This is ridiculous. And I swore that if I was going to do like a party-based RPG again in future, it would just be a fixed cast. This kind of concept that you can choose who's in your party and who isn't, I think honestly does more harm than good for that kind of story. You get this weird paradox with this is a separate subject really, but you get this weird paradox in BioWare games where it's supposed to be like if you ask someone what's good about BioWare games, they'll tell you it's the party NPCs, right? It's the characters, it's getting to know them. It's Tali and it's Mordin and it's Rex and it's all these great characters. But actually, you just go chat with them they don't have much to do with the game. You go chat with them on your ship, and then you go off and play the game, and they're not there, or like 2 of them are there. There's like 17 characters, and only 2 of them come with you. So and so they don't actually have very much to say. They might yell, "Oh no," and like, "Oh, I get to hear 'oh no' said in Rex's voice rather than in someone else's voice." Great. Diana said writing 1 million variants of the same conversation to account for every combination of choices is hellish. Yeah, it's really hard work, and no one sees. This is kind of my point here about the cost, right? No one sees it. I wrote 17 versions of those conversations, and I really put effort into it. I made sure that they were different, that the people who were participating in the conversation made the conversation flow, differently, so that it felt like a different conversation rather than them just kind of a different NPC saying the same thing in a different way. They said different things, and they each had their own point of view that they wanted to get across. But the combination of the two that you had with you meant that they maybe would or wouldn't prompt a particular response from each other. I really put the effort into doing a good job of it. I mean, not very many people have played my Neverwinter Nights module in the first place, but even of those that have, none of them have played it through 17 times to see all those different variants of the dialogue. Diana says it's a huge waste of the writer's time. I agree. It's just like, I could have written 17 conversations in that time instead of 17 different conversations. Hardly any of and sorry, that's not so. It's not to say that choice and interactivity don't matter. And personally, in my own development, I think I've overreacted a bit and not done it at all, which is why I recommend don't do anything, don't do any choice at all, but don't stick to the sort of cheaper interactive structure. Find ways to reward the player's agency. Find ways to use your finesse to sell them on the fact that the small choices they have made do matter. Don't brute force it like I was doing and do 17 different variations. All right, I think I better wrap it up there. Oh, Diana said, I think replayability, unless in really short games, restarting like Inkle's Overboard, is something severely overhyped. I mean, it's very player dependent, right? Like, I agree personally, with my player hat on. Like, actually, I mean, particularly, at this point in my life, I barely have time to finish games in the first place, let alone replay them. I think there is a niche, very dedicated audience for whom replayability is a huge consideration. Hex said, I barely have time to play the game I have, let alone play the same game multiple times. Yeah, exactly. I think there is a niche audience who are interested in that kind of thing, and I think it's a selling point, I think, for a certain player type. But I think that the expectation, especially in large, expensive games, that they reward replayability is probably not something that can be really, easily paid off. If the game is, if the replayability elements are relatively cheap to implement, and they give a sense of agency the first time through, and then seeing the second version of it the second time through, if you do play it again, that's pretty good. But yes, I think in terms of it being overhyped from a business perspective, unless your target audience are specifically people who are looking for that feature, then yes, I think I would agree. I think overhyped is probably a reasonable way to put it. It's made out by that niche audience as if it's the fundamental factor that makes computer games special, that makes computer games matter. And I don't think that's actually true for the majority of players. It certainly is true for a minority, but not for a majority. Anyone else have any other questions? Otherwise, I'll leave it there. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. That was really cool. I may be streaming games again soon. But I will. My plan was to do more of this sort of talk, but I feel like they need polishing up to a better level than I normally do them at work. So I'm not sure whether I will be doing that or not. But this one seems to go quite well, so I'll try to do some more and see how it goes. Thanks, everybody.